Hello, I am Babette Scotts and I work with the Danish Refugee Council on protection information management. And today I am joined by Purvi Patel and Maria Elena Hernandez.
Hello, my name is Maria Elena Hernandez. I am the PIM project coordinator for Latin America. I work with the Danish Refugee Council, and my role as PIM project coordinator is to organize PIM trainings throughout Latin America and consolidate a PIM community of practice in the Americas.
And I am Purvi Patel. I am the PIM consultant who is working with Maria Elena to adapt PIM for an online format during the last several months. Formerly, I was with UNHCR as UNHCR staff in both Ecuador and Mexico. And I was trained as a PIM champion when I was in Mexico, and to some degree tried to incorporate some PIM elements while I was there. But it's more in my role as a consultant that I've really been able to work on PIM more fully.
What is the background to these trainings that you have organized, and who did you want to train and why?
As you probably know, Latin America and the Americas in general have seen an unprecedented crisis of displacement, and most of these crises are protection crises. With that in mind, the PIM framework is very useful when we have these big displacement crises. So the need for the training was clear because now we have operations across different countries responding either to the Venezuelan crisis or to a Central American crisis. And therefore, there was a clear gap in how we do protection responses based on evidence. And that requires, of course, data and information in a way that we use it in a collaborative way in systematized processes. And therefore, we realized that the PIM framework was going to be so important for the region. But the PIM framework was not in Spanish. So having all those resources of the PIM framework in Spanish has become one of the great tools that now we have in the region. And we targeted PIM trainings as well to all the leads, co-leads, and information management officers in different countries in the region. So that was the idea with the purpose of later having a better network of PIM champions, because now was very limited, who have been trained in Spanish, who now have the resources in Spanish, and that can start that community of practices in their respective coordination fora.
Why did you decide to host the TOT online?
We started thinking about this project in the Americas in January 2020, when the world was very different. And thus we thought that we were going to do this PIM TOT in person for 5 days in Panama, and it was going to be, just another PIM TOT for the first time in Spanish. And then the pandemic started. And we realized that things were not going to change. We waited for a bit, and the restrictions for traveling in the Americas were very clear, and also the security of the participants. So by mid-2020, we decided that we needed to still go ahead with this training because the responses were still needed, and the need for information was still there. So we decided that we were going to adapt this in an online version. One of the reasons was that because we did not see any possibility of traveling anytime soon, but the need for the PIM framework was still there. And therefore, we decided to adapt this, and that's when we invited Purvi to join us, because, as a PIM champion, and one of the few PIM champions in the Americas who speaks Spanish, she was very helpful with this, but obviously it became with the challenges. So we decided to adapt one part to an online training, which is also, adapting a TOT is very different than adapting just a PIM training event. And then we decided to divide it in two. But that it came mainly because of the pandemic and the realization that we were not going to travel anytime soon.
Can you tell us more about what kind of trainings you have facilitated during these past months during the pandemic, and using what kinds of modalities?
So we have adapted the TOT for the Americas. We had mostly an online, like a large online component that was over the course of 4 weeks. And then Marielle sort of did a wrap-up review session and filling in any gaps that we weren't able to do online, and an in-person training for 3 days that took place in Panama. And I have to say, Marielle was really the one who sold me on like, yes, this, come work on this project. This was a good project. I'm so glad she did, because it was a really good experience in trying to see not just how can we take this content, but how can we deliver it in a new format using different tools than we might usually think of, to really get that interactive nature that PIM brings, keep that sort of interactivity, but also adapt it to the new reality that we were working with. And then afterwards, we were also invited, or I was invited to help adapt PIM for the Libya context, me and the other consultant that I was working with. Libya was not a TOT. It was a full training to try to get PIM into the everyday working environment of the staff in the Libya operation. So it was a slightly different context. Very, very interesting. We adapted some new tools for how we could implement certain modules of the PIM training for an online format for not a TOT, but an actual implementation. And so it was a very good experience to have that in the two different environments, two different contexts, two very different ways of working within the regions. Very interesting, but also inspiring to see how you could adapt PIM in a very localized way, but in this universal sort of we have to work online reality. And then the tools, I'm sorry, we used different platforms. Our main platform was Zoom. We explored the option of using Microsoft Teams or using Google Meet. A lot of it has to do with the individual functionality of the different platforms and what is required in the design of the module. So you can definitely adapt that to the platform. And then on top of that, we use different interactive platforms and tools that already exist. There's a wide variety of digital infrastructure that exists now for more interactive trainings. And so it was sort of looking at what was out there and what we needed to incorporate for different elements. So you could use Kahoot if you wanted to do a trivia component. You could use different sort of platforms like Mentimeter or Poll Everywhere for different elements of the PIM trainings as needed. There's so much infrastructure right now that you can kind of pick and choose to what your learning needs are.
So can you share what were the main challenges that you encountered with adapting the training and conducting it virtually, and what solutions did you find?
Well, I think Mariela may have a slightly different perspective on this, but I think we agree in the sense that the idea of an all digital training, trying to get everyone's focus and attention for a certain period of time is absolutely a challenge. That's every working environment for the last 8, 9, 10 months, right? So the idea is, what is the balance between how much we can get people to actually stay online and how we can get them to engage? The other big challenge for me was this mentality shift that has to happen of what the expectation of an online training is. I think prior to COVID, the expectation was, oh, it's a webinar. I'm just going to put it out in the background and I can multitask. I can check my email and things like that. And the way that we design the training is very interactive. Once you are working on one of our trainings, your focus has to be with us because we're asking questions, we're expecting everyone to input, we're forcing you to actually interact with the people online. And so that it makes it very hard to multitask. And having that mentality shift is definitely difficult to explain to someone before they actually experience it. And also difficult to explain to the supervisors of participants. The participant may be fully engaged, but then may get an email that says, oh, can you just do this really quickly for me? And making sure that everyone understands, like, actually, even though you're on your computer, you really have to be engaged the whole time. It's a definitely mentality shift.
I will completely agree. I think this is a new era of working and training. I think one of the challenges that we saw from the beginning was, how do we make this TOT interactive? The PIM TOT requires a lot of work. This is not a simple webinar. You need to be engaged, you need to be able to learn the concepts, because you're going to teach the concepts after. You're going to facilitate training. So you need to acquire those skills, attitudes within the PIM core competencies. So how do we do that when every participant has a phone that is ringing, is working in their home, and there might be many distractions that were not there on a PIM TOT for 5 days? And also, how do people interact and learn from each other? We adapt this adult learning style into an online training. And what we did was, everything is very interactive. So as Purvi said, in every session, we have different tools. We use different tools to make sure that participants engaged. We make sure that participants have the time to meet each other and feel comfortable with each other. So we did multiple icebreakers online and with multiple platforms. So that was very nice then, because people feel more comfortable talking to each other. We used a lot of breakout rooms as well, so people were able to interact. So that also helps, because from a training that were 20 something people, then you go to a small room, and then you're forced to interact and talk. And what we did constantly was that we encourage participants to speak and to participate and contribute. So that keeps people constantly engaged. Again, there's many distractions that we cannot control when you are online.
I will add one more thing. The other big challenge is to replicate some of that out of session interaction that happens in a real life training. And to some degree, you're not going to be able to replicate that in the same way. But we did try to use tools like using WhatsApp or Signal groups so that people could have conversations offline when we're not in the session, but still chat to each other, still send each other pictures of their working spaces, jokes, memes, whatever, to try to build that online digital community in some way, even though it's not fully replicable when you're not, having lunch or dinner with people at an in-person training. So that's also very important.
That this relates to the PIM principle of competency and capacity. Is it really possible to enhance people's capacity on PIM through an online training? And what are the main skills, attitudes, and knowledge that are being transmitted through an online training?
That when we look at the skills, the knowledge, and attitudes of the like the competency domains of PIM, there are many that can be acquired online, right? Like we can really look at how we understand, for example, humanitarian protection principles and their application. In our first webinar, our first module, we really focus on the PIM principles, and that went very well, and we could see that the participants were able to engage with that content. Same thing with the with how the humanitarian system works, every phase of the humanitarian response, international norms. So the knowledge was very easy, I think, in my perspective, was very easy to transmit because the participants were engaged. So we did a pre-learning module for every webinar. So they had to prepare before going online, and then we did a post-learning module. So we saw how they were acquiring this knowledge and putting it into practice with practical examples. I think what is harder, I will say, is the attitudes part of the table of the PIM competencies. And the reason why is because I think that it's harder to adapt. Online training is something very new. So adapting that part, the skills that we look for the day-to-day have to be adapted online. So now the participants have to do all these attitudes, but adapt them into online working. It's not only facilitating PIM trainings, it's also how they put into practice PIM, the PIM framework in their operations. And they will have to communicate that online. And I think that part was the hardest part for me to actually facilitate how you acquire those attitudes, how you adapt them online. That being said, because our TOT had an in-person component, I think that part was acquired more in the in-person training for those 2.5 days.
I would definitely agree with this component that Marielle highlighted in our methodology of having a pre-learning component and a post-learning component outside of the actual session. With the reality of it's hard to keep people's attention online for long periods of time, the idea was, let's take as much of this theory offline as possible. Let's make sure that they have the chance to go through the theory primed already when they come into the learning session. And then when they're doing the application to their everyday context, they can also do that offline in developing plans or tools or data sharing agreements, so that the online portion, since we have limited number of hours that we can keep everyone's attention, is focused on that interactive component, is focused on the exchange of like experiences and ideas as much as possible. That was a huge part of it. And the other part is that, this difference between the TOT and a learning event. So the TOT, we did have to work on facilitation skills. And I think, first of all, there is a gap in the understanding in the humanitarian sector of facilitation being an actual skill set. It's not just, I am a subject matter expert in this, so of course I can do a training. Facilitating a training, facilitating learning in what you know is a skill in and of itself that I think should be developed just in general in the sector more. But also, facilitation skills online are very different than how you facilitate in person. Energy, the way you talk, is important in both contexts, but how to keep people engaged is very much a skill set that has to be adapted. So we try to include that part in the TOT. How to compensate for that in a non-TOT version in a PIM training is that we had to develop new tools entirely. So if I want you to be able to identify the components of a protection needs assessment or a protection monitoring plan, my co-consultant, Gada Al-Nasri, and I had to develop tools so that they could visualize how they needed to organize the information in a way that may have been more organic in person. That was a bit of the change in how to adapt, but also really facilitate the learning, not just the content, but the learning portion of that, you know.
If you compare online training with in-person training, what do you think worked really well with the online training, maybe even better than an in-person training?
I will say there is a lot of creativity. I know that's hard to think of, but if you really look at the tools that are out there, there's so much possibility for creativity, how to rethink how we are presenting material, how we are engaging other people. Because online you have to be creative. It's a necessity. Otherwise you end up having a boring webinar. And so with that already on the minds of everyone, I think we really had some very creative results. We actually, when we had a component in the TOT where everyone had to present a portion of the module, we got some really creative presentations from the people who were presenting, just trying to adapt to the new way of working. So that I think was very, very good. Marielle, I don't know if you have a thought
Yeah,
on that.
I think that the creativity that requires an online training, you develop other tools. You know, I think you have to think outside of the box to really engage with the participants. But I think there's also something very interesting that works very well in online training, and it's that you're going to reach different profiles that probably you wouldn't do otherwise. And this is something that it goes beyond COVID, right? Like we have to think about how we can online training can reach colleagues who might not be able to travel due to travel restrictions, to acquiring a visa, or because of simple humanitarian access. And I think that's the fantastic thing about online training now and how we perceive it. If we're able to adapt that training and facilitate online, then we can look at maybe we can reach field offices that are very remote, and or we don't have the resources to bring everyone to a capital for an online training. And how we do that is very interesting. The modalities. In the TOT, we had a session that was fantastic, and that was when we were in person. Our colleagues from Peru were connected online to live streaming, and they were able to facilitate to an in-person session with the technology that we were using. And I think that really can reshape the way we think and how creative we are and what type of audiences we're able to reach. So I think that works better in a way, what type of audiences we're able to reach and how we interact with them. So the dialogue is more open, I think.
Yeah. Second, we did have a conversation about what this would look like post-COVID, because we did what we did because of COVID. But in a post-COVID world, I think there are three very clear situations in which this would be very good to have an online component or option. Accessibility, as Mariela says, absolutely, and including accessibility for funds. You know, operations don't always have the money to physically bring people and pay the DSA and have everyone in one place. It's much more expensive. So accessibility for sure. Security, I would also say in the last year, there have been a lot of talks about how to decolonize the humanitarian sector and aid, how to increase opportunities, how to make things more equal within the sector. And when it comes to training, this is absolutely the case for the ability for international staff versus national staff to access professional development. Very often it is international staff who have more opportunities because of visas, maybe because of how planning just happens to work out, because of security, a lot of things, because they can't leave their families if they're single parents or things like that, lots of considerations. And being able to have these kind of options really could go a long way towards addressing that parity, equality issue, the access, and especially professional development for national staff. And there are different ways of doing it. We could do what Colombia did, which was have a large online component and then a 3-day in-person workshop at the national level. You could have people within one country operation or one duty station together physically, where they could interact with each other physically, but then have multiple offices sort of wired in together. There are many different ways that you could potentially incorporate in-person and digital components that would really open up the access to PIM trainings and to be able to mainstream PIM into everyday work on the ground.
My last question to both of you is basically, how is the PIM framework important in your work?
Well, at this moment, I am coordinating a PIM effort in the Americas. So PIM is relevant every day at all times. But I've been a protection manager before this. And the PIM framework, it's not because I'm a PIM enthusiastic. Like I really, the PIM framework has helped me a lot in multiple ways in how I organize my day-to-day work in my protection interventions. I did a lot of protection monitoring programs in the past, and the PIM framework, especially that chapter on the PIM matrix, for me has been so useful to train my staff. The PIM principles have helped me a lot when I have had coordination positions, especially in protection clusters or protection working groups. So I think the PIM framework helps me a lot in how I organize my ideas, how I put together proposals, and also how I communicate with my colleagues outside protection, but also in protection within DRC and with other agencies. When we are able to speak the same language and in a coordination fora, we understand that protection monitoring is different than that protection needs assessment. It's easier for us to organize a coordinated response in the way that we decide how we are going to share data, how we're not going to replicate efforts. I think all the framework, it has made my job easier, and especially when the response has to be coordinated, for example, in the Americas with multiple countries, right? When we have to share data to inform our responses. So I think that has helped me a lot as a protection manager. And well, now, again, I use it every day because it's part of my job. But I think it's very useful when you're in the field or in coordination positions.
I would say my role is obviously very different from Marielle, but I do think that it is difficult when you're in the field to sort of see you. There's so much being thrown at you all at once. How do you organize information? How do you coordinate with other agencies? Your coordination objectives on the ground may not be the coordination objectives of people at the country level office or at national office. So how do you make it work in the field in a way that makes sense? And what PIM offered me when I first got trained as a PIM champion was a framework in which to conceptualize what it was I was thinking and feeling but couldn't articulate. As in, like, okay, this is a framework that helps me identify the gaps that I was inherently feeling were there but didn't know how to explain. Like, this is how we need to share data more. This is how we need to differentiate where the sources of our data are coming from, and can we coordinate those different sources of data into something more cohesive? These are things that I was always a very data-oriented protection staff member, and I think that created its own challenges, because that even using data on a regular basis is a new way of working that is being championed perhaps at the headquarter level, but is being implemented in the field very differently. So those were definitely challenges that I felt, and definitely frustrations that I felt. And PIM offered me a framework to address some of that, especially in a place like the Americas. It provides so much potential to be able to address the existing gaps and improve coordination on the ground. And I think that would change a lot.
Thank you so much for sharing. This has been extremely informative and inspirational. And good luck with all your future work on PIM, Purvi and Maria Elena. And thanks for joining this discussion today.
Thank you, Babette. Thank you, Purvi.
Yeah, thank you for having us.